They were supposed to die within minutes. October 25, 1944. Off the coast of Samar, the Pacific was boiling with smoke and fear. On the radar screens of a few small American destroyers appeared a nightmare, an entire Japanese fleet. Battleships, cruisers, and heavy guns so massive they could crush steel with one hit. And yet, instead of retreating, those tiny U.S. destroyers charged straight toward them. This was no ordinary battle. It was a suicide charge, one that would change naval history forever. The dawn of October 25th broke over the Philippine Sea with blood-red clouds, a fitting color for what was about to unfold. The U.S. Navy's Task Unit April 3, 77, known simply as Taffy 3, was stationed off Samar Island. Their mission was simple: air support for the landings on Leyte. Their ships, small, fast escort carriers, and a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, ships meant to protect, not fight. But that morning, the Pacific suddenly betrayed them. From the northern horizon, lookouts shouted the warning. Enemy ships, battleships, cruisers closing fast. Within minutes, the sea erupted. It wasn't a small enemy patrol. It was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurida's center force, the core of Japan's Imperial Navy, armed with Yamato-class battleships and heavy cruisers. It was a fleet designed to destroy an entire carrier group, and standing in its path were a few destroyers weighing less than one-tenth its firepower. Building drama. On board the USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans, a man known for his fiery spirit, stood on the bridge and stared at the impossible sight. He knew what those massive Japanese guns could do. He knew the logical order was to retreat and survive. But he also knew, if Taffy 3 ran, the Japanese would reach the American invasion fleet at Leyte. Thousands of soldiers, undefended, slaughtered on the beaches. Evans took a deep breath, turned to his men, and said words that became legend. All ahead, flank. Commence attack. Let's go get the bastards. The crew froze for a moment. They couldn't believe it. Their commander had just ordered a destroyer to attack a battleship. The impossible charge begins. The Johnston accelerated, its engines screaming as it pushed through waves taller than the ship's bridge. The Japanese fleet opened fire first, giant shells whistling overhead, each one weighing more than a car. The ocean exploded with columns of water. Every miss was death just narrowly avoided. Evans barked over the intercom, "Keep firing. Close the distance." His plan was pure madness, but also pure genius. The Japanese guns couldn't lower fast enough to hit a destroyer at close range. If he got inside their firing arc, he could strike first with torpedoes. At 10,000 yards, 8,000, 6,000, the Johnston fired 10 torpedoes at the Japanese cruiser Kumano. Moments later, a massive explosion tore through the sea. Kumano's bow disintegrated. One of Japan's most powerful cruisers was crippled by a ship that weighed one-tenth its size. A chaotic sea of heroism, but the victory came at a cost. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, turned its guns toward the Johnston. Each 18-inch shell could sink the destroyer in one hit. The sky flashed, thunder rolled, and the Johnston was lifted from the sea by shock waves. Fragments ripped through the hull. Men were thrown from their posts. Evans, his face bleeding, grabbed the phone. "Keep firing. We're not done yet." He ordered smoke screens to hide the carriers, giving the slow escort ships behind him a fighting chance. Even as the Johnston bled oil and took on water, it refused to turn away. Meanwhile, other destroyers, the USS Hull and USS Herman, saw what Evans was doing and followed him in. 3 small destroyers, Outnumbered and Outgunned, now charged an entire Japanese battle line. Emotional moment, crew courage. In the engine rooms, sailors fought to keep the turbines alive, even as hot steam burned their faces. On deck, gunners worked barehanded, blood mixing with oil as they reloaded again and again. One sailor later wrote, "I didn't think about dying. None of us did. We just didn't want to let Commander Evans down." That was the heart of Taffy 3, not armor, not size, but belief. Belief that they could make a difference even when logic said otherwise. The sea turns into hell. By mid-morning, the Japanese fleet was in complete confusion. Their radar officers couldn't understand what was happening. They thought they had encountered a full American battle group. Evans' suicide charge had convinced the Japanese admiral that he was facing something far larger than reality. The sky darkened with American aircraft. Wildcats and Avengers from the tiny escort carriers swooped in, dropping whatever they had left. Depth charges, rockets, even pistols. Some pilots flew unarmed runs, just to draw fire away from the ships below. And all the while, the Johnston, burning, crippled, but still firing, stayed in the fight. The time was 10:15 a.m., October 25, 1944. The USS Johnston was bleeding from bow to stern. Smoke pouring from its shattered hull, decks slick with seawater and oil. But even as flames crept closer to the bridge, Commander Ernest Evans refused to give the order to abandon ship. "We're still fighting," he growled. "As long as one gun can fire, we fight." The destroyer's crew, barely 300 men, had already done the impossible. They had crippled a Japanese cruiser, drawn fire away from the escort carriers, and confused an entire battle fleet. But now, the cost of that bravery was coming due. The final stand begins. The sea around Samar had become a nightmare. Shells rained from the sky like thunderbolts. The Japanese Yamato, Kongo, and Haruna fired salvo after salvo, each explosion throwing columns of water 200 feet high. The Johnston, half-blind from smoke, zigzagged wildly, her engines coughing, her hull groaning under the strain. Each maneuver was a gamble. One wrong turn, and an 18-inch shell would tear her apart. Down below, sailors worked waist-deep in rising water, pumping desperately to keep the ship afloat. The heat was unbearable. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, scalding men alive. But they didn't stop. A gunner's mate shouted over the roar, "Sir, forward guns are gone." "What now?" Evans' voice came back, calm, steady, like stone against the storm. "Then we use the aft ones. Keep firing." The battle intensifies. Everywhere the eye could see, chaos. The destroyer USS Hull was hit and sinking. The Heermann was on fire. Above them, American aircraft dove through sheets of flak, attacking with everything from rockets to sidearms. Pilots radioed desperate messages. "Out of ammo. Going in again. They're shooting at me, but I'm gonna make another pass." The sea was alive with courage. Tiny ships, crippled planes, all defying logic, all clawing for one more moment of resistance. At 10:25 a.m., the Johnston turned her guns toward a Japanese heavy cruiser closing in. The range was just 7,000 yards, suicide distance. But Evans didn't care. He ordered a full salvo from the remaining 5-inch guns. The shells ripped into the cruiser's bridge, killing officers, jamming turrets. It was like throwing pebbles at a giant, but these pebbles hit hard enough to make the giant bleed. The human cost. The ship was dying. Every deck was covered with shattered steel, fire hoses, and bodies. Men crawled through smoke to drag the wounded below. Medics worked by feel, blood and seawater mixing on their hands. In the wardroom, a young sailor pressed a tourniquet on his friend's leg and whispered, "We're gonna make it, buddy. We're gonna make it." But even he didn't believe it anymore. On the bridge, a shell tore through the railing, shredding Commander Evans' uniform and severing 2 fingers. He didn't even look down. He wrapped his hand in a rag, grabbed the speaking tube, and shouted, "Get that torpedo crew ready. One more run. The last torpedo run." At 10:30 a.m., with smoke pouring from every vent, Johnston made her final attack. Her torpedo tubes were still operational, barely. Evans ordered a turn toward the Japanese line, her engines wheezing, her propellers slicing through the crimson water. The men knew this was the end. They had seen the Heermann limping away, hull sinking beneath the waves. Now it was their turn. The torpedo officer called out, "Range 6,000 yards. 5000. 500. Evans waited until he could almost see the enemy crew through his binoculars. "Fire all fish." 5 torpedoes streaked from the side of the ship, slicing through the water like silver blades.
Moments Leyte.
Boom! A Japanese heavy cruiser was hit amidships, smoke and debris exploding skyward. The men on the Johnston cheered. But the celebration lasted only seconds. Then came the reply. A full broadside from 3 Japanese ships struck the Johnston. Hours later, the survivors floated in the wreckage, surrounded by oil, debris, and the bodies of their brothers. Sharks circled. The sun burned their faces. Many would spend over 50 hours in the water before rescue arrived. One sailor remembered looking back and seeing the Johnston's stern slip beneath the waves, her flag still flying. He whispered, "She fought to the last." Out of 327 men, only 141 survived. But they had done something no one thought possible. They had stopped an entire Japanese battle fleet. The confusion and fear caused by their desperate stand convinced Admiral Kurita to retreat, believing he was facing a much larger American force. In truth, he was retreating from courage itself. Emotional close, legacy of courage. In the days that followed, word of the battle spread through the U.S. Navy. Sailors whispered the name Johnston with awe, the destroyer that charged battleships and didn't back down. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American naval officer to receive it. Historians later called the Battle off Samar the most heroic action in modern naval history. But for the men who lived it, it wasn't about medals or glory. It was about protecting the men on those carriers, about duty, and about never giving up. One survivor said years later, "We didn't think we'd win. We just thought maybe we could buy them a few more minutes. That was enough." Those few minutes changed history. But what happened after the Johnston sank is a story few have ever heard. The ocean didn't just take lives that day. It carried messages, debris, and survivors across miles of burning sea. Some would be rescued. Others would vanish forever. The explosions were deafening. Bulkheads split open. Fire roared through compartments, and the destroyer began to list to port. Still, Evans refused to stop fighting. "Keep firing," he shouted again. "Don't let them think we're done." The Sea of Heroes, the other ships of Taffy 3, the Gambier Bay White Plains, and the small destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts were still fighting too. The Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, charged straight into the enemy line with guns blazing, just as the Johnston had done earlier. Its captain radioed to the fleet, "We're going in. Cover us if you can." For over 30 minutes, that tiny ship fought Japanese cruisers 10 times its size, firing every round it had, even practice shells. When it finally went down, survivors said it felt like the ocean itself was crying. Evans saw the smoke of the Roberts disappear over the horizon and muttered under his breath, "Brave sons of guns." He knew the end was near. The death of the Johnston. At 10:50 a.m., a massive shell struck the engine room. Lights went out. Pumps failed. The Johnston began to slow, then stall completely, dead in the water. Evans gave the order, "Abandon ship." But most of the lifeboats were destroyed. Men jumped into the sea. Some burned, some bleeding, some carrying wounded crewmates in their arms. Oil slicks caught fire, and the water itself seemed to burn. From the bridge, Evans watched as his ship, his home, slipped beneath the waves. He turned to his surviving officers and said quietly, "You did good, boys. You did good." A moment later, another shell tore through the bridge. Evans was seen one last time, standing tall at the helm, steering the burning ship as it sank. He was never found. The aftermath, the ghosts of Samar, the forgotten survivors, the silent ocean, and how the legend of the destroyer that refused to die lived on for decades beneath the waves. The sea had gone quiet. Hours after the guns fell silent, only the faint hiss of waves remained, rolling gently over the wreckage of what had once been a battlefield. The air smelled of oil, salt, and death. And beneath that shattered horizon floated the men of the USS Johnston, survivors, barely alive, clinging to debris and life jackets in the middle of the Philippine Sea. Some called it the Ocean of Ghosts, because for those still breathing, it felt like they were surrounded by the dead. The aftermath of heroism. When the destroyer slipped beneath the waves at 10:50 a.m., it didn't just take a ship, It took an entire brotherhood. Men who'd fought side by side for months suddenly found themselves alone, scattered across the dark water. The sky was still thick with smoke, and the sun burned like an enemy above them. The oil slick coated their faces, made breathing difficult, and turned the sea into a suffocating black mirror. Chief Bosun's mate Robert Hagen was among the wounded. He floated beside a torn life raft, his arm shredded by shrapnel. When another sailor swam toward him and said, "Hang on, Chief. Help's coming," Hagen just whispered, "We were the help." Hours passed. The sound of distant gunfire faded, replaced by the moans of the dying. Some prayed, some cursed, others just stared into the endless horizon, waiting for rescue that might never come. The survivors' test of faith. By nightfall, the ocean had become a graveyard. The tropical heat turned cold, waves rolled higher, and with every swell, more bodies disappeared beneath the surface. Seaman Walter Anderson later recalled, "You'd be talking to someone one moment and the next they were gone. No splash, no scream, just gone." The survivors tried to group together, using floating debris from the Johnston, pieces of decking, a broken gun shield, even a refrigerator door, to form makeshift rafts. They rationed water, but there was almost none. When it rained, men opened their mouths and prayed for just a few drops. Sharks came next. The smell of blood and oil drew them in by the dozens. They circled silently at first, brushing against legs, bumping the wreckage. Then they began to feed. Sailor Frank O'Brien said he could hear the screams echo across the water. Brief, sharp, then silence. He would later say, "Hell wasn't fire. Hell was the ocean that night." Hope and despair. By the second day, exhaustion set in. Men began to hallucinate, seeing rescue ships that weren't there, hearing voices calling their names. Some swam toward mirages and never came back. But others refused to give up. They told each other stories of home, of family, of what they'd do if they survived. One sailor, delirious with fever, whispered, "Commander Evans is still alive. He's out there somewhere. He said he'd never leave us." That belief that their captain was still fighting kept some of them alive. They imagined him on another piece of wreckage, steering them all home. And in a way, maybe he was. Back at the American base, confusion reigned. Reports of the battle were chaotic. Some thought Taffy 3 had been wiped out completely. Radio silence from the Johnston and Hull confirmed the worst fears. For over 24 hours, no rescue ships were sent. By the time aircraft finally reached the area, hundreds of men had already died from wounds, exposure, or shark attacks. Only scattered survivors remained, drifting, sunburned, delirious. A PBY Catalina pilot spotted the wreckage and radioed. "Oil slicks and survivors sighted. Looks like what's left of a destroyer crew." When the first rescue boats arrived, what they found was beyond comprehension. Men who had been in the water for over 2 days, covered in oil, barely conscious, their lips cracked and bleeding. Some clutched the hands of dead friends. Others still whispered, "Evans said we'd make it." Of the 327 men who had served aboard the Johnston, only 141 survived. The legend of Ernest Evans. Commander Ernest Evans' body was never found, but his spirit haunted the Navy like a ghost. A legend whispered in wardrooms and training decks for years to come. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his valor, the first Native American officer in U.S. Navy history to receive it. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, he gallantly gave his life for his country. But for his men, no medal could capture who he was. They remembered his grin in the morning mess, his gravelly laugh, and his unshakable belief that courage could outfight fear." One survivor later said, "Evans didn't just command a ship, he commanded our hearts. When he turned toward those battleships, we followed him because we believed in him more than we feared death." The unsung heroes of Taffy 3. While the Johnston story became the stuff of legend, other ships in Taffy 3 shared that same impossible courage. The USS Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, and Heermann all charged battleships 10 times their size. The Samuel B. Roberts, dubbed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, fired until its guns overheated, scoring direct hits on Japanese cruisers. When its ammunition ran out, the crew threw whatever they could, star shells, practice rounds, even food cans, into the guns and kept firing. Before sinking, its captain radioed, "We're dead in the water, but we're still fighting." These men weren't just sailors, they were defiance made flesh. Each one believed that maybe, just maybe, if they held out a little longer, the rest of the fleet would survive. And they were right. The enemy's view. What few people know is that even the Japanese fleet was stunned by what they faced that day. Admiral Kurita, commanding the entire center force, had expected to crush helpless carriers and their escorts in minutes. Instead, he met an enemy that fought like lions. Japanese officers reported, "We believed we were fighting cruisers, perhaps even battleships." They had no idea they were facing tiny destroyers and escort carriers. When Kurita finally ordered the retreat, he did so because he was convinced there were still major American reinforcements nearby. But in truth, it was the courage of a handful of destroyer men that made him believe it. Even Japanese survivors later said, "The Americans fought like demons. We could not understand how such small ships attacked so boldly." The cost of victory. By the time the smoke cleared, Taffy 3 had lost 2 destroyers, 1 escort carrier, and a destroyer escort. Nearly 1,000 men were dead or missing, but their sacrifice had saved the lives of tens of thousands. Because of their stand, the Japanese fleet failed to reach the American landing forces at Leyte, a turning point that helped seal Japan's fate. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison would later write, "The battle off Samar was the greatest display of sheer bravery in the history of the United States Navy. But for the survivors, medals and praise meant little. They lived with memories that wouldn't fade. The screams, the oil, the smell of burning steel." One survivor said, "When people call us heroes, I think of the ones who didn't come back. They're the heroes. We just survived." The sea remembers. Years passed. The Pacific grew calm again. The world moved on, new wars, new heroes, new memories. But beneath the waves, the Johnston still rested silent, waiting. For decades, no one knew exactly where she lay. Then, in 2019, deep-sea explorers located wreckage nearly 21,000 feet below the surface, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. The photos showed the hull still proud, the gun mounts still aimed toward where the enemy once was, as if even in death, the ship refused to lower her weapons. When former Navy men saw the footage, many wept. One survivor's son said, "She looks like she's still fighting, like Dad's still up there on the bridge." The ocean, it seemed, hadn't forgotten, and neither had history. There's a quiet moment in every war story when words fall short. When bravery becomes something beyond human comprehension, something sacred. That's what the men of the Johnston became. Echoes in the waves, ghosts of valor that still whisper across time. Every sailor who walks the decks of a destroyer today carries a piece of that legacy. They know the story. They know the name, because courage like that never dies. As historian James Hornfisher wrote, "They fought above and beyond the limits of human endurance. They turned despair into defiance, and defiance into victory. And perhaps that's why their memory endures, not because they won, but because they refused to lose." But the story doesn't end at the bottom of the sea. In the final part, we'll uncover how the battle off Samar changed the U.S. Navy forever, how the legend of 18 destroyer men shaped naval doctrine, inspired generations, and redefined what courage truly means. The battle that changed everything. The untold legacy of the destroyers that dared to charge the impossible. The ocean was still. The waves rolled quietly over a patch of sea where courage once burned brighter than fire. Below, almost 4 miles beneath the surface, rested the twisted steel of the USS Johnston. A grave for heroes, a monument carved not in stone but in sacrifice. But even now, 8 decades later, that battle, that impossible charge, still echoes through every destroyer that cuts through the sea. Because what happened off Samar didn't just save lives. It redefined what the word bravery truly meant. When news of the battle off Samar finally reached America, it sounded unbelievable. Reporters couldn't understand how a handful of small destroyers had driven off Japan's most powerful fleet. Some thought it was a mistake. Others said it was divine intervention. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew the truth. He simply said, "This was not luck. This was the spirit of the United States Navy." The story spread like wildfire. Sailors whispering it in mess halls, pilots retelling it over whiskey, and even civilians reading about it in morning papers. The men of Taffy 3, once just an escort group nobody had heard of, became legends overnight. In Washington, the Navy ordered a full inquiry. How could a force of escort carriers and destroyers survive against an armada of battleships? The answer shocked them. Pure leadership, unshakable teamwork, and courage that defied logic. Admiral Sprague's after-action report was short and humble. He wrote, "Our destroyers attacked without hesitation. They made the enemy think he was facing a much stronger force. Their example saved the entire task group." When the investigators read the survivors' testimonies, they were stunned. Men firing until the guns melted, helmsmen steering through burning oil, medics bandaging wounds under machine gun fire, and sailors laughing in the face of death. One line from a junior officer stood out. "We weren't fighting for victory. We were fighting because Captain Evans told us to." That sentence, that faith in leadership, became a case study in the Naval Academy for decades to come. The Navy realized something profound. Technology and size alone don't win wars. Willpower does. After Samar, U.S. naval doctrine began to change. Destroyers were no longer seen as small or support ships. They became the heart of fleet action. Training manuals began using the Johnston's charge as an example of initiative and aggression. Young officers were taught, when you can't win, fight harder. When you can't survive, make your death count. The phrase "a Johnston charge" entered naval slang, a term for a suicidal, all-out attack that changes the outcome of a battle. Even today, destroyermen speak of pulling an Evans, doing the impossible because someone has to. But for those who lived it, the cost never left. The survivors carried memories that time could not wash away. They had seen friends vanish beneath waves, ships burned to their bones, and courage tested beyond endurance. Years later, during reunions, old sailors would gather at memorials and stand silently, faces weathered, eyes distant. Some couldn't speak about it at all. Others told stories only when drunk enough to forget for a few minutes. One survivor, Frank O'Brien, said in an interview, "We didn't think about glory. We thought about staying alive. But if we had to die, we wanted to make damn sure the Japanese remembered our names." And they did. Japanese naval records later revealed that Admiral Kurita was shaken by the encounter for the rest of his life. He once told a journalist, "Those destroyers fought like no men I've ever seen. I withdrew because I believed they would never stop coming." It wasn't the guns that scared him, it was the spirit. Commander Ernest Evans became a symbol far greater than the battle itself. His Medal of Honor was accepted by his wife, Margaret, who said quietly, "He always told me he'd rather die fighting than live a coward." At the ceremony, the Navy Secretary read his citation, but even that couldn't capture what he'd done. Because Evans hadn't just led his ship into battle. He'd led men into immortality. Years later, the destroyer USS Evans, D-1023, was named in his honor. And in 2021, when explorers filmed the real Johnston wreck, the footage showed something incredible. The ship's forward guns were still locked in the same position they fired from in 1944, aimed directly at the spot where the Japanese fleet had been. Like even in death, the ship still stood guard. For every hero remembered, there were dozens whose names never reached the headlines. Men like gunner's mate Leonard McCoy, who kept firing even after losing his leg. Signalman John Carlin, who transmitted the Johnston's final message, "We're going down fighting." And dozens of deckhands who never made it home. Sailors who didn't die for fame or glory, but because they refused to turn away. Their letters home were found floating in waterproof bags. Some addressed to mothers, some to wives, one simply reading, "If you're reading this, tell the kids I did my duty." Those letters were the real victory. Proof that even when the ocean swallowed their bodies, it couldn't drown their courage. In today's Navy, the spirit of Samar still lives. Destroyers bear the names of ships that fought there: Johnston, Hull, Roberts, Heermann. Every sailor who walks those decks is taught what happened on that October morning in 1944. They study Evans' tactics, how he used smoke, speed, and chaos to trick an enemy 20 times stronger. They memorize his words: "We'll attack full ahead. All guns, fire." At sea, when destroyers cut through storms, many sailors say the same thing. Evans would have liked this weather. It's their way of honoring him, the captain who turned fear into fire. And every October, when the Navy holds remembrance ceremonies, someone always says, "To the men of Taffy 3, who showed us that courage has no limits." The battle off Samar remains the most unbalanced naval fight in modern history. A clash where bravery, not firepower, decided the outcome. It's studied in military academies worldwide, not as a tactical success, but as a lesson in moral dominance. When faced with annihilation, the destroyer men didn't retreat. They advanced. They made the enemy retreat first. Admiral Kurita's massive fleet, with its Yamato-class battleships and cruisers, never reached the American landing forces, because a handful of men refused to let them. In doing so, they changed the course of the Pacific War. Leyte Gulf became the largest naval battle in history, and Samar was its beating heart. Imagine, for a moment, the last seconds aboard the Johnston. Smoke everywhere, decks burning, men shouting prayers and orders. Evans, wounded, gripping the bridge railing. The ship shuddering under shellfire but still firing back. He turns to his crew and yells, "Keep shooting! Don't let up!" And even as the destroyer breaks apart, the guns are still blazing. That's the last image the survivors remember, their captain standing tall in the storm, fighting until the end. That's not just a war story. That's a definition of leadership, of faith, of love for your men and your country. Decades later, when deep-sea explorers placed a memorial plaque at the site, it read, "They fought the impossible and made it yield." Divers said the wreck looked peaceful, as if resting after a long watch, the ocean's currents gently passing over the rails like the touch of time. One diver whispered into his radio, "She's still here. The Johnston's still guarding her station." Maybe that's true. Maybe the sea itself remembers their names, carrying their echoes in every breaking wave, every storm, every whisper of the wind. Because the men of Samar didn't just defend a fleet. They defended the very idea of never giving up. Even when defeat was certain. In every age, in every war, there are battles fought with bullets and steel, and then there are battles fought with heart. The battle off Samar was both. It wasn't about victory on a map. It was about the victory of the human spirit. The moment when courage overpowers reason, when loyalty outweighs fear. As one old sailor said years later, "We didn't win that day, but we sure as hell didn't lose." The destroyers that charged the Japanese fleet did more than protect carriers. They protected the soul of the Navy. And as long as there are men who sail the seas, the names Johnston, Evans, and Taffy 3 will live on, etched not in history books, but in the hearts of those who still believe that courage can change the world.